Hardcore Henry is just one of those truly different films. This entire movie was shot through one person's point of view, and therefore had to be completely invisibly stitched together from hundreds of individual chaotic shots into a series of much longer and more complicated ones, all by using one of the most invisible and complex visual effects I've ever seen, and all to do something that no other filmmaker has ever really managed to do. Make a first-person shooter video game in real life and make that work for an entire hour and a half. Because to pull this off, the filmmakers had to go to such extreme lengths that it's genuinely amazing that either no one died on set making this, or that no visual effects artist died from overtime doing all of these invisible visual effects. So, to get into why this film was so complicated, so dangerous, and also why nothing like it has ever really been attempted since, get your nice jacket and your GoPro as we dive into the literal insanity of how they pretty much brought an entire video game to life on a tiny budget of only $2 million. So how did this point of view, or POV style, come about? Why was it so stressful? And how did they make it work for an entire film? Well, when you're trying to make a first-person shooter video game come to life, one of the two major pillars that you have to get right is that, of course, the entire thing has to be shot from a first-person point of view. And so luckily, this film's director, Ilya Naishuller, definitely just butchered that name, and his team had actually been testing this POV style for years leading up to Hardcore Henry. As throughout a series of music videos and other projects, they'd basically been trying to get this POV style to the point where it'd actually be possible to enjoy it for an entire hour and a half long movie. Because the problem they'd run into time and time again is that whilst the camera used for this film, the GoPro, is great for filming stuff like sports footage from the first person, and was therefore also perfect for filming all of this film's insane stunts, which we'll get to in just a bit, what they found was that trying to do pretty much anything else with this camera was an absolute nightmare, particularly when it came to trying to film a full-on narrative story with it. Because by default, the GoPro always gets placed right at the top of the camera person's head, and this meant that it was always sitting at a point that was way off from the body's center of gravity, and was therefore sitting at one of the shakiest and least relaxing points you could possibly watch a movie through. But far worse than this, what the filmmakers also found was that the top of the head is just a rubbish position for narrative scenes anyway, because you're basically looking through some guy's forehead, and so no conversation could ever actually have that natural feel to it, because now the co-stars would be forced down into those lower 2/3 of the screen, unlike they are in basically every other movie, which could be fine for a few minutes, but after a while could create this really uncomfortable watching experience. And so these were issues that Naishuller and his team were running into constantly leading up to Hardcore Henry. But luckily, this also meant that by the time they actually got round to doing this film, they'd also actually kind of figured out the solutions to most of these problems. And interestingly, the solutions that they'd come to were the exact same solutions that video games had come to many years prior. And that was that, from an audience or a player perspective, the best position for this camera was actually going to be directly in the cameraman's mouth, as this position at a lower center of gravity not only allowed for much less shaky camera work with much better eye lines and perspectives as well, but it also meant that you could actually see the protagonist's full body, which made the whole thing a lot less jarring to the audience, as now there was something to actually ground this camera and the character behind it into the world. And so with this in mind, they went and built a series of weird custom GoPro mouth rig things, which were now perfectly refined to meet the demands of this film and give them the freedom to both shoot completely in the first person, but also start drip feeding in those tiny little subtle video game style movements, like that classic game style overswing as the camera moves around, to really begin to start doing something different and something special for this film. However, this was only really half the battle when it came to making a real life video game. And so this is where we can really begin to see why this film ended up relying on one of the most invisible bits of visual effects work I've ever seen. Because when you're playing a first-person video game, within a single level, no matter what happens, you're almost always looking directly through your character's eyes. And so there's never really any changes in perspective or cuts like there are in your typical third-person cinematic movie. And instead, everything is just like this big, long, never-ending singular take, which from a filmmaking perspective is an incredibly hard hard thing to get right, because it means that to do these long no-cut shots, you basically have to take these absurdly long bits of footage, which in turn require insane amounts of planning to make sure stuff like the lighting's always correct and the actors are always in the right place at the right time and the camera moves to frame them at the correct moments, because of course the longer and longer a shot gets, then the more and more elements you have to manage and maintain. And basically everything just becomes this logistical nightmare that Naishuller and his team just didn't have the money to overcome. And so this was probably why, in the end, they decided to fall back on the modern day solution to basically any filmmaking problem, and that was to just fix it in post. Which first brings me to the most important part of this video, selling out to a brand. But because I have some standards, I decided that if I was going to sell out to a brand, it might as well be a good one, which is why this video is sponsored by NordVPN. Because you might just think that a VPN is good for acquiring stuff for free, but I've been specifically told not to mention how good NordVPN is for that, and that you can just click the link in the description for a massive discount with 4 months extra for free when you get their 2-year plan. And so instead of mentioning that, I thought I'd just run through the list of the other stuff that NordVPN can do, like how they have robust traffic encryption that doesn't share or track anything you do in line, meaning that when you're looking at the questionable weird shit that you do, you are completely safe and completely private, and no one can look in on it. Or I should mention how they have real-time threat protection that can keep you safe from all of those weirdos and freaks and malware you can find online, meaning that when you're on those websites that you shouldn't be on, you can now browse safely and confidently in the knowledge that NordVPN is blocking those adverts, pop-ups and dodgy links that are all out to get you. But above all of these, my favorite feature has to be their kill switch feature, which means that if you ever accidentally drop from the VPN, then your connection gets immediately terminated. And this single feature has really helped me browse in confidence, because I know that my data is safe and won't ever get leaked just because my internet dipped out for 1 single second. So I really do wholeheartedly recommend NordVPN for a safer and more private online browsing experience. And what's lovely is that they're actually offering a 30-day money-back guarantee, no questions asked, so the whole thing is basically completely risk-free to try out. So become safer online with the fastest VPN on the planet by clicking on my link in the description to get a massive discount along with 4 months extra for free if you get their 2-year plan. And with that, thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video, and now back to the video and how they fixed these long shots in post. Because rather than having to shoot these long complex shots that go on forever, what Naishuller and his team realized was that it'd be much easier to just shoot a series of individual, shorter, and therefore much more simplistic shots, and then invisibly stitch all of these different shots together using visual effects to give the illusion of one big long shot that has 0 cuts in it, which is actually something we've seen a lot of times before in a lot of other films, but on nowhere near the scales that Hardcore Henry managed to pull this off on. Because what these other typical third-person films will do is usually have a very slow and controlled approach to creating these seamlessly stitched together shots, usually by having a very calm and deliberate pause on something that is simplistic and still, because that stillness and that simplicity will make it very easy to stitch the 2 shots together. But with Hardcore Henry, with the camera being mounted to some guy's head, and with all of the little natural movements and twitches that come along with that, there was literally no way of guaranteeing that identical clean stitch points between the 2 shots. And so what this meant was that in order to actually create these seamless stitch points between all of this chaos, the poor visual effects artist basically had to fake this stitch point by creating entirely new footage from scratch, which would be able to bridge that gap between the 2 shots. And so this wasn't as easy as just getting the existing footage and moving it around a little bit, because once you shoot a video, it becomes basically 2-dimensional, and so it can't respond to the camera's movement in the same way it does in real life. And so instead, what they basically end up having to do is take a frame of that footage that had already been filmed and then break that up into its individual elements. Because if they then rebuilt this entire scene out of 3D geometry, then they could take these separated elements and layer those over these individual bits of 3D geometry, and then use this to add that depth right back into the picture. Because now they had this almost 3-dimensional picture that could respond to the camera's movement correctly enough that it could just about be used to create the fake footage needed to bridge the gap between those 32 stitch points, which, to be honest, is just an insane way of going about doing these seamless long takes, because even that little description I just gave about what they were doing was a massive oversimplification of how they did this. And in fact, in reality, this whole fake footage process was so complicated that there was not really any one-size-fits-all approach to doing this, which meant that instead, basically every single one of these invisible cuts had to be manually approached and achieved through its own sheer brute force method to get working. So the fact that this entire film is littered with hundreds of these little cuts, whilst other films might have like 2, and that you have no idea that they did any of them, is truly absurdly impressive. And it was this fantastic process that now unlocked the second major key to making a video game movie, which was, of course, the freedom to create these long first-person takes. And so with these deeper levels of freedom finally acquired, this is now where they could begin to focus on the more artistic parts of this film and start infusing some life and some character into the way that this camera moved. And so this is, once again, where video games provided that perfect blueprint for the filmmakers. Because video games figured out years ago how to draw emotion from the point of view of the silent protagonist. You know, often by doing stuff like having them slowly look down to portray sadness, or by having the other people on screen emote in a specific enough way that they give context to how your character is feeling. And so with a good bit of planning from the filmmakers, and with a lot of very clever acting from both the camera operators and their co-star Sharlto Copley, stuff like this could be transferred over to the film on a fairly simple one-to-one basis and slowly start building up the character and the emotions of Henry. But when you start to look a little bit closer at the kinds of first-person shooter video games that inform this film, at the end of the day, the overwhelming emotion that gets portrayed in-game isn't sadness or happiness or anything like that, but instead, the primary emotion that the filmmakers needed to capture to make this film work was just basically chaos. Because with the world of video games not being bound at all to the limits of reality, it means they're constantly able to push the boundaries of visual spectacle. And so to truly make a video game in real life, then beyond everything else, the real challenge that the filmmakers would have to overcome would be recreating those same insane stunts and moments on those same ridiculous scales. And so this is truly where Hardcore Henry really pushed the boat out, because at a glance, for a lot of these stunts, like where they were smashing a guy's head through a glass table with glass flying right past his neck, or firing a flamethrower at the cameraman, who was at that point completely shirtless, or running right along the very edge of a bridge with absolutely no safety equipment at all, you'd assume there were some green screens involved, or that there was a lot of CGI in use to keep this all as safe as possible. But no, they really did a lot of this for real, with stunt actor cameramen like Andrei Diminutiv and Sergei Varlev, who, again, sorry if I got that completely wrong, basically genuinely risking their lives to make a lot of this possible. And that's of course not to mention all the other stunt people who are also involved, like this poor lady here whose job was just to get hit in the face, for example. And so, not that I really endorse, nearly dying for a movie, but because of it, they were able to do an insane amount to keep this film as intense and as full of visual spectacle as possible. But of course, these stunts were only actually one side of the coin needed to make all of this game-like chaos work. Because despite not needing CGI for safety reasons, it was still used all over this film to create things that would never be possible practically, and to create all of those explosions and gunfire and crazy stuff that you always run into throughout video games. And you know what? The end result of this CGI is just fantastic, because despite this film's tiny budget, it's been so well leveraged, with it being applied through largely just much more economical, subtle enhancement rather than full-on, full-blown replacements, and with it also being married so closely to that practical baseline. It means that the result of both of these coming together is one of both supreme visual spectacle that also manages to remain as grounded as possible in reality, which in turn gives you this genuinely intense feeling when you watch this, despite it still maintaining all of the madness of a video game. And so this is just such a special achievement, especially when you consider just how ridiculously hard it was for them to add this high-grade, intense CGI to this footage that was taken on a GoPro. Because despite all of those shot on iPhone adverts, there is still a reason why these movies are shot on these big, massive cameras. And one of those reasons is that these big cameras are able to capture this insanely high-resolution footage with these insanely wide ranges of color that something like a GoPro just literally can't capture. And so all of this color and all of this resolution, that's actually really great for visual effects artists, because now there's so much real information that they can inject into their digital fakery that can really help make it look as good as possible. Whereas when you're you're working from what a GoPro shoots with its much smaller amount of captured data, then all of those little things like reconstructing those in-between frames all become just that little bit harder, because now the source footage you're working from has such little genuine information that the visual effects artists basically have to depend more and more on creating their own fake information to get any of this to work, which of course isn't ideal for either productivity or realism. And so this was already one major problem when it came to working from GoPro footage. However, because of the specific lenses that these cameras use, there was actually a much bigger problem than any of this put together. And that was that basically everything you filmed with this camera would always have that weird warping effect around the edges of the footage. And when you're trying to make visual effects, you do not want to be working on a warped image, because then you have to start integrating that warp across all of your visual effects as well, and this can start multiplying the difficulty of a shot very quickly. And so, because every camera lens tends to have some degree of warping, there is actually a pretty standard process you can use to remove that warping for you and give you a flat image to work on, so that when you're done doing your visual effects to it, you can simply just warp it back to look like the original footage, and it all lines up with the warped footage of the rest of the film. But when it came to footage taken on a GoPro, that lens warping effect was just so intense that this entire process of dewarping just took forever to do, which meant that before they could add any of these invisible stitches or any of this CGI, every single shot taken on the GoPro had to go through hours and hours of custom treatment to remove this warping. And so basically, when it came to this film, whilst what you saw on the surface were these flashy video game effects, where the true magic of this movie lied was in the subtle, invisible ones that quite literally pulled this film together, and which actually enabled a story to be told just via the movements of this head-mounted camera. And so when you look at this as one big picture, I think it's pretty clear to see why Hardcore Henry is such a special movie, because it takes what could have just been its only gimmick, this point of view camera work, and overcomes every single limitation it faced to bring us probably one of the most intense and immersive action movies I've ever seen, which with a budget of its size is just such an impressive achievement. But what do you guys think? With video games rising in popularity more and more, why has no one else made a film like this? And what other films do you think have more intense action scenes than Hardcore Henry? But yeah, if you like this video and you want to see more deep dives into the best visual effects of the last 20 years, then please let me know in the comments below, drop a like and subscribe. Oh, and we also have a Discord channel where we chat about a lot of this stuff too, so please check the link in the description for that as well. Oh, and finally, I just want to give a massive thank you to all of my Patreon subs. So thank you to Matt Locke, Cthulhu88, Chris Coling, Archer Green, Modern Adventurer, and an even bigger thank you to Lime, Darren Birmingham, Rye Jones, Ishita Thakar on YouTube, and of course, the utter legend that is Darth Gator. Your support really helps keep the quality of these videos as high as possible, and it really means a lot, so thank you again. But otherwise, yeah, thank you for watching and have a great day.